Hollow Tides of the Drowned God. Chapter 5. The Tidelord's Bargain. The air in the derelict filtration cistern was thick enough to chew. It tasted of rust, of the briny ghost of recycled water, and the sharp electric tang of ozone from a dying junction box somewhere in the dark. Jorin huddled in the curved belly of the tank, his back pressed against the cold, weeping metal. Every drip of condensation that ran down the wall and soaked into the collar of his jumpsuit was a fresh violation, another reminder of the crushing weight of the ocean that was Amphitrite's sky, its walls, its grave. He was down to the last of it. The nutrient paste, a gray, flavorless ribbon squeezed from a foil packet onto his forefinger. He stared at the meager ration, his stomach a hollow knot of hunger and dread. The city's constant deep-frequency thrum vibrated up through the cistern floor, a groan that was less a sound and more a state of being. It was the background noise to his life, to everyone's life. But now it felt personal. It was the sound of a cage contracting. He licked the paste off his finger. It had the texture of wet grit and tasted of nothing, but it was sustenance. It was real. He focused on the sensation, a desperate act of grounding. Feel the texture, taste the blandness. This is real. You are here. It didn't work. Can't feel my fingers. So cold. The voice was new. A man's, thin and reedy, laced with a shivering panic. It slid into his mind like a needle of ice, uninvited and intimate. Jorin flinched, his eyes snapping open to the oppressive dark. He wasn't alone. He was never alone anymore. It's the echo, he told himself, the words a silent mantra against the rising tide. Just the damn choral echo. Not real. But the whispers felt more real than the nutrient paste. They were a cacophony now, no longer just the haunting echo of his own daughter, Lily. They were a crowd of ghosts jostling for space behind his eyes. The seal. Check the seal. It's screaming. I can hear it screaming. Mama? Where did the light go, Mama? And beneath them all, a single pure note of terror that was always his to bear. Lily's voice, clearer than it had been in years, no longer a faded memory, but a fresh wound. Daddy, it's dark. I can't swim. I know, Lilybug. I know. Rust rot. He was talking to them. He slammed the back of his head against the cistern wall, the dull thud a welcome shock of pain. Don't answer them. Don't give them a foothold. They weren't real. They were just archives of death, parasitic memories feeding on his guilt. He crumpled the empty foil packet, the crinkle of the material deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. That was when a new sound sliced through the gloom, a real one, the high-pitched whine of a servo, followed by the heavy, rhythmic clang of mag boots on the gantry outside his hiding spot. Compliance. Jorin's blood went cold. He pressed himself flatter against the cistern's curve, trying to melt into the shadows and the grime. A beam of white light, sharp and merciless, cut through a rust-eaten grate above him. It painted a stark, moving rectangle on the opposite wall, illuminating a decade of decay-slick black mold, weeping fissures, and the spectro-green-gold glow of glimmer moss clinging to a corroded pipe. The light swept past. Jorin held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The patrol's cold, sterile announcement and the hot, panicked final moments of a dozen strangers. He squeezed his eyes shut, but that only made it worse. He saw flashes, a torrent of black water rushing through a broken viewport, the wide, terrified eyes of a child, a hand scrabbling uselessly at a pressure-locked hatch. Compliance! Jorin's blood went cold. He pressed himself flatter against the cistern's curve, trying to melt into the shadows and the grime. A beam of white light, sharp and merciless, cut through a rust-eaten grate above him. It painted a stark, moving rectangle on the opposite wall, illuminating a decade of decay-slick black mold, weeping fissures, and the spectral green-gold glow of glimmer moss clinging to a corroded pipe. The light swept past. Jorin held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The patrol's cold, sterile announcement, and the hot, panicked final moments of a dozen strangers. He squeezed his eyes shut, but that only made it worse. He saw flashes, a torrent of black water rushing through a broken viewport, the wide, terrified eyes of a child, a hand scrabbling uselessly at a pressure-locked hatch. Rust rot. He was talking to them. He slammed the back of his head against the cistern wall, the dull thud a welcome shock of pain. Don't answer them. Don't give them a foothold. They weren't real. They were just archives of death, parasitic memories feeding on his guilt. He crumpled the empty foil packet, the crinkle of the material deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. That was when a new sound sliced through the gloom, a real one, the high-pitched whine of a servo, followed by the heavy, rhythmic clang of mag boots on the gantry outside his hiding spot. Compliance! Jorin's blood went cold. He pressed himself flatter against the cistern's curve, trying to melt into the shadows and the grime. A beam of white light, sharp and merciless, cut through a rust-eaten grate above him. It painted a stark, moving rectangle on the opposite wall, illuminating a decade of decay-slick black mold, weeping fissures, and the spectral green-gold glow of glimmer moss clinging to a corroded pipe. The light swept past. Jorin held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The patrol's cold, sterile announcement, and the hot, panicked final moments of a dozen strangers. He squeezed his eyes shut, but that only made it worse. He saw flashes, a torrent of black water rushing through a broken viewport, the wide, terrified eyes of a child, a hand scrabbling uselessly at a pressure-locked hatch. A symptomatic individual may display disorientation, auditory hallucinations, or an unusual affinity for damp and closed spaces. They are a contamination vector. They are a threat to the whole. He's talking about me. The thought was a shard of glass in his gut. I am the sickness. I am the threat. The paranoia he'd been fighting for days bloomed into full-blown panicked terror. They weren't just hunting a fugitive, they were hunting a disease, and he was patient zero. He could hear them moving again, their boots clanging with finality as they continued down the corridor. The beam of light swung away, plunging the cistern back into absolute black. Jorin stayed frozen, his hands pressed to his skull, waiting. The clanging faded, swallowed by the ever-present thrum of the city. He was alone again. He shakily lowered his hands. The silence left by the patrol was a vacuum, and the echo rushed to fill it. The whispers returned, not with a chaotic roar, but with a chilling, conspiratorial intimacy. They're gone now, but they'll be back. This place isn't safe. The metal groans. Daddy, it's still so dark. Jorin's breath hitched. His sanctuary was now just another trap. The patrol hadn't found him, but they had flushed him out all the same. The ghosts in his head were right. He couldn't stay here. He was out of food, out of time, and running out of mind. The gnawing hunger in his stomach was now matched by a desperate animal need to move, to run, to find another hole to crawl into. But where? Where in this rusting, drowning city was there to go? He pushed himself stiffly to his feet, his muscles screaming in protest. The dripping of the condensation seemed to count down the seconds he had left before he was found or before the whispers drowned him for good. The only sound was the frantic rasp of his own breathing, amplified by the tight, echoing confines of the service corridor. Jorin ran. His heavy work boots slapped against the grated floor, each impact a flat, percussive beat against the city's deep-frequency thrum. Behind him, the shouts of compliance officers were swallowed by the maze of pipes and groaning metal. They weren't just searching anymore. They were hunting.
He skidded around a corner, slick with black iridescent mold, his hand bracing against a bulkhead, weeping cold condensation. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the sharp, metallic tang of rust. He was deep now, in the guts of the sump, a level below the familiar warrens he called home. Here the lights were sparse, just the sickly orange glow of emergency sodium lamps casting long, distorted shadows, and the ghostly green-gold shimmer of phosphorescent fungi clinging to the dampness. Every drip of water, every shudder of the hull was a nerve-shredding threat. His lungs burned, the whispers in his head, the usual suffocating memory of his daughter's last breath, were now a fractured chorus. A woman's panicked prayer in a language he didn't know. A technician's final choked curse as water filled his helmet. The choral echo was feasting on his panic, churning the stolen deaths of others into the foreground of his mind. Rust rot, he gasped, stumbling to a halt. The corridor ended abruptly, not in a wall, but in nothing. Before him lay a chasm. A vast vertical shaft plunged into absolute crushing blackness, a wound in the city's architecture. Far below, the distant, monstrous groan of a primary reclamation turbine was a constant, gut-vibrating hum. A network of colossal pipes and conduits crisscrossed the void, sweating and bleeding dark fluid. Spanning the gap was a single, narrow-maintenance catwalk, its grated steel surface eaten away by decades of moisture and neglect. It looked like a skeleton's rib cage, brittle and frail. There was no going back. He could hear the methodical tramp of boots growing louder behind him. Desperation was a cold hand on his spine. He took a hesitant step toward the catwalk, his boot crunching on loose flakes of rust. The structure was maybe 20 meters across, an easy walk on a good day in a stable section. This was neither. He placed a foot onto the walkway.
It wasn't a thought. It wasn't an idea. It was a sudden, violent overlay of information, plastering itself across his vision. For a terrifying, disorienting second, the rusted catwalk was no longer just metal. It became a diagram of its own failure. Shimmering, ethereal lines of force, a spiderweb of impossible physics, bloomed in the air. He saw stress vectors in incandescent red concentrating right where his next footstep would land. He saw a hairline fracture, invisible to the naked eye, depicted as a searing, jagged fissure of light. A cascade of numbers and symbols, tensile strength calculations, metal fatigue coefficients flickered at the edge of his awareness. It was the cold, analytical language of an engineering diagnostic, the kind the Spireborn used on their perfect simulations. But this wasn't a simulation. It was a premonition, delivered in the language of physics. Failure point, 7.3 meters from origin. Torsional stress exceeding yield strength. The knowledge was not his. It was alien, sterile, and absolutely certain. It was the city itself, or the ghost of the man who built this catwalk, screaming a warning through the static of the echo. His body locked up. The shouts from the corridor behind him were closer now. "Shouting! Sector 9 Delta! Seal the access junction!" He had to move, but the vision was absolute. Another step and the metal would tear like wet paper. To his left, a thick, sweating coolant pipe, easily a meter in diameter, ran parallel to the catwalk, about 2 meters away. It was an insane jump. A slip meant a one-way trip into the sump's forgotten depths. His rational mind recoiled. His training, his experience, everything that made him Jorin the welder, screamed that it was suicide. But the echo screamed louder. The glowing red lines on the catwalk pulsed, brightened, a final urgent alarm. The memory of a long-dead engineer's calculations was more real in that moment than the feel of the grating under his boots. He didn't decide, he just acted. Trusting the ghost in his machine, he took 2 quick running steps back on the solid ground of the corridor, then launched himself forward. He wasn't aiming for the catwalk, he was aiming for the pipe. He flew through the ozone-stale air, arms outstretched, his entire being focused on the impossible, alien certainty that this was the only path.
His hand slapped hard against the cold, slick surface of the pipe. His fingers, raw and desperate, found a purchase on a raised valve flange. His boots scraped against the curved metal, failing to find a hold. For a heart-stopping second, his entire body weight hung from one straining arm. With a guttural cry, he swung his other hand up, grabbing the flange as well. He clung there, his body dangling over the abyss, his muscles screaming in protest. And then, exactly where the vision had predicted, the catwalk gave way. It didn't just break, it died. A shrill, agonizing shriek of tearing metal echoed through the shaft. The section of catwalk he would have been standing on, the section highlighted in the ghost diagram, twisted downward. The entire structure buckled, ripping away from its moorings in a shower of rust and sparks. It fell into the blackness, a mangled spine of steel, its death cry diminishing as it plunged into the crushing dark below. Silence returned, heavy and absolute, broken only by his own ragged breathing and the steady drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the dark. The shouts of the compliance officers were gone, cut off by the chasm. He was alone. Hanging from the pipe, a tremor began in his arms, spreading through his entire body until his teeth chattered. It wasn't the cold, it wasn't the exertion. It was a new kind of fear, colder and deeper than the fear of falling. It was awe, twisted into horror. He hadn't saved himself. Something else had. He looked at his hands, expecting them to be different, alien. They were just his own hands, calloused, grimy, shaking. But the knowledge they had acted upon was not his. He had borrowed the senses of the city itself, a dead man's expertise, a fragment of consciousness archived in the rust and the water. He was a vessel, a conduit, and the thing inside him was no longer just a whisper of grief. It was an intelligence. It was learning to use him. The fall would have been a kindness. This was a violation. He had survived, but he was no longer sure who or what was doing the surviving. The market thrummed with the desperate energy of a dying heart. Here in the sump's gut, the perpetual groan of Amphitrite's hull was a bass note beneath the symphony of decay. Kale perched in the shadows of a defunct filtration manifold, the sharp tang of ozone and rust coating the back of his throat. Below, a river of humanity flowed through the makeshift canyon of repurposed cargo containers, their faces illuminated in the sickly orange cast of sodium vapor lamps and the ghostly green of bioluminescent fungi clinging to wet pipes overhead. His eyes, however, were fixed on 2 figures, the welder, Jorin, and the sump-rat mystic he was traveling with, Hestian. From this distance, Jorin looked unremarkable,
Just another hull clinger in a worn jumpsuit, his shoulders slumped with the weight of the ocean above. But Kale had been tracking him for 3 cycles, and unremarkable was the last word he'd use. "He's on the move again," Runa's voice crackled in his ear, a tight whisper over their closed comlink. She was 50 meters to his left, concealed behind a stall selling grimy, salvaged pre-inundation data drives. "I see him," Kale murmured, his gaze unwavering. "Stay put." Jorin was guiding the wiry mystic through the crowd, not with force, but with an odd drifting certainty. He didn't push, he flowed, finding gaps in the throng moments before they opened. It was Hestian, pale and draped in fungal cloths, who looked like the guide, but it was Jorin who led. Suddenly, the welder stopped dead. He cocked his head, his eyes unfocused, as if listening to a frequency no one else could hear. The deep-frequency thrum of the geothermal turbines seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a silence only he perceived. "What's he doing?" Runa asked. "Waiting," Kale whispered back. He watched, fascinated. Hestian placed a hand on Jorin's arm, a questioning look on his face. Jorin shook his head once, a subtle, sharp motion. He held up a hand, palm out. "Wait." 1 second. 2. Then, with a sudden lurch, Jorin grabbed Hestian's thin arm and pulled him sideways into a narrow, unlit gap between a protein-paste kitchen and a power conduit housing. The space was barely wide enough for 1 man, slick with black mold and dripping condensation. They vanished from sight. Not a moment too soon. Clump, clump, clump. The rhythmic, heavy tread of mag boots on steel plating cut through the market's din. A 4-man compliance patrol, clad in black armor and carrying pulse carbines, rounded the corner Jorin would have been standing in front of. Their helmeted heads swiveled, emotionless blue visors sweeping the crowd. They paused, their presence sucking the life out of the immediate area, the haggling and chatter dying to a nervous hush. Kyle held his breath. Runa cursed under hers. "Astrad, that was close!" Close didn't cover it. It wasn't a reaction, it was predictive. Jorin hadn't seen them, couldn't have heard them over the market's noise. He had felt them coming. Kyle activated the primary channel. The soft hiss of the open link was followed by a low growl, like grinding stones. "Report," Grendel's voice commanded, laced with the crackle of a signal routed through a dozen unauthorized relays. "Boss, we're on him," Kyle said, his voice low. "He just ghosted a compliance squad. It wasn't luck. He knew they were coming." A long silence stretched from the other end, filled only by static. Kyle could picture Grendel in his throne of salvaged metal. His one good eye narrowed, the gears of his massive hydraulic claw arm whirring softly. "Keep on him. I want to see what else he can do." The link clicked off. Kyle motioned to Runa with a flick of his fingers. "Circle around." The compliance patrol moved on, and a moment later Jorin and Hestian slipped back into the flow of the crowd, as if they'd never left. They moved deeper into the market, toward the older, more treacherous sectors, where the floor plates were a lattice work of solid steel and rust-eaten traps. This was Kyle's territory. He and Runa shadowed them from the gantries above, their movements practiced and silent. They knew this place. They knew which beams to trust, which pipes would hold their weight. Down below, Jorin moved with that same impossible knowledge, but without the years of experience. He sidestepped a pressure-warped floor plate that Kyle knew would shriek like a banshee if touched. He guided Hestian around a puddle of corrosive lubricant leaking from an overhead gearhouse. He never looked down. His feet just knew where to land. It was like watching a drifter, one of the blind, pale fish from the abyss, navigating by pressure waves Kyle couldn't perceive.
"It's not just the patrols," Runa whispered over the comm, her professional cool fraying into genuine awe. "He's reading the architecture. How?" Kale didn't answer. He was watching Jorin pause near a junction where a thick bundle of power cables descended into the floor. The welder knelt, placing his palm flat against the vibrating deck plate. He closed his eyes. His expression was one of intense concentration, not of a man hiding, but of a man listening to the walls, to the very bones of Amphitrite. This was the moment Kale understood. This wasn't a fugitive. This was something else entirely. Jorin wasn't just in the sump, he was connected to it, a nerve ending in the city's dying body. He opened Grendel's channel again. "Grendel," Kale said, the word coming out with more weight than before. "You need to see this. He's not running scared. It's like the sump is talking to him. He knows where the weak points are, where the patrols will be, where the hall is groaning loudest. He's tuned in." There was a long pause on the line, longer this time. Kale could hear a faint, rhythmic click hiss, the sound of Grendel's hydraulic claw clenching and unclenching, the sound of a creditor's mind at work. "Tuned in." Grendel's voice was a low purr, the growl replaced by a chilling, intrigued calculation. "I like that. The Spireborn see a sickness, a symptom, a loose wire to be snipped." Another pause, punctuated by the metallic hiss of the arm. "I'm starting to see a key to every locked door and pressure gate in this rust-bucket city." The shift in Grendel's tone was palpable. The hunt was over. The acquisition had begun. "He's too valuable to let compliance get their sanitized claws on him," Grendel commanded, his voice now sharp and decisive. "Runa, you take the low conduit access at GRID 9. Cut off his route to the deeper warrens. Kale, you block the main artery back to the primary market. Don't spook him, don't rush him, just box him in. Use the flow of the crowd, funnel him toward the old turbine hall, and no marks. I want him clean for the interview." "Understood," Kale replied. The comm went dead. He caught Runa's eye across the chasm of the market. She gave a single, sharp nod, her expression now hard and focused. She melted back into the shadows, gone. Kyle took a deep breath, the air thick with the promise of jewel shits and the scent of ozone. Below, Jorin stood up, his hand leaving the deck plate. He looked around, not with fear, but with a wearied, pained confusion, as if the voices of the city were becoming too loud. He started moving again, right toward the path Kyle and Runa were now preparing for him. The game had changed. They were no longer just watching a ghost. They were helping to trap it. The conduit was a dead end, a metal intestine that terminated in a pressure hatch so thoroughly colonized by rust it looked more like a scab of oxidized iron than a feat of engineering. Perfect. Jorin leaned his back against the cold, weeping metal, sliding down the bulkhead until he was in a half-crouch on the grated floor. His breath came in ragged, burning bursts, each one a cloud of steam in the frigid air that tasted of ozone and recycled water. A single drop of condensation, fat and heavy, detached from a pipe overhead. It fell with agonizing slowness, a tiny silver bead reflecting the sickly orange glow of a distant work lamp before striking the crown of his head. The tap was as loud as a hammer blow in the relative quiet. He didn't flinch. The city was always talking, in groans and drips and hisses. You just had to learn its language. He closed his eyes, focusing on the deep, foundational thrum of the geothermal turbines vibrating up through the soles of his boots. For the first time in hours, the other voices, the ones inside his skull, had receded to a background hiss, like water moving through distant, silt-clogged pipes. Not gone, never gone, but quiet enough. He could almost pretend the only ghost haunting him was the memory of his own daughter's laugh, a sound that was now a blade twisting in his gut. He'd lost Hestian and the others in the chaos of the last patrol sweep. One moment they were a knot of silent shadows moving through the maze of the whispering gills. The next, klaxons had blared through the district, their panicked shrieks echoing off the metal vines of pipes and wiring. They scattered like startled fish. Now he was alone, a single nerve, frayed and exposed in the groaning body of Amphitrite. He was just starting to feel the phantom kiss of safety on his skin when it happened. Click, click, click whoomp. The world dissolved in a blast of pure chemical white. 3, maybe 4 beams of light converged on his position, so bright they felt physical, a pressure against his eyeballs. They pinned him to the bulkhead like an insect in a collector's case. He threw a hand up, his retinas screaming in silent, searing protest. The afterimage, a pulsing network of black suns, burned behind his eyelids. To his left, a lean woman with oil-smeared goggles pushed up on her forehead held a high-intensity plasma cutter, its focusing nozzle aimed dead at Jorin's chest. The air around its tip shimmered with contained heat. Her face was a mask of grim neutrality. The third figure was a towering silhouette, but Jorin could make out the telltale gleam of a non-regulation exoskeletal brace on his arm, the kind of black market hardware that could punch through a bulkhead if you juiced it enough. No uniforms, no insignia, just the hard, pragmatic look of hull clingers who had spent their entire lives wrestling with the crushing physics of the abyss and won. These weren't soldiers. They were mechanics, scavengers, Tidelords. The realization landed like a block of ice in his gut. The smell hit him then, a confirmation that overrode the omnipresent ozone and rust. The acrid, earthy scent of glimmer moss, the psychoactive fungus the syndicates cultivated in the darkest, wettest corners of the foundation levels. It clung to their gear like a shroud. A new kind of cold seeped into Jorin's bones, a chill colder than any deep-water dive. The fear of compliance was the fear of a system, impersonal, bureaucratic, absolute. They would test him, dissect him, erase him. It was a known, sterile quantity. This was the fear of the unknown. These people weren't part of a system. They were a cancer growing within it. They operated on a different logic, a different morality, profit and survival. They wouldn't file a report. They wouldn't follow protocol. They would just make him disappear. The thought sent a fresh tremor through him. The whispers in his head stirred, waking from their slumber, a low chorus of panic that wasn't his own. Trapped, cornered, no air, no light, the water is rising. He grit his teeth, forcing the voices down, shoving them back into the dark corners of his mind. Not now. The man in the center took a half-step forward. The light from his shoulder-mounted torch haloed his head, throwing his face into shadow, but Jorin could feel the weight of his stare. He didn't speak. He simply tilted his head, a slight, almost casual gesture, back towards the mouth of the conduit Jorin had just entered.
The message was as clear as a pressure alarm. Back the way you came. Jorin hesitated for a single thumping heartbeat. He glanced at the sealed hatch behind him. A tomb. Then back at the men and their repurposed tools. An execution squad? Or something else entirely? There was no choice. There never was down here. The illusion of free will was the first luxury to go. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself to his feet. His legs felt like lead pipes filled with sand. He kept his hands raised, a useless, placating gesture to men who dealt in leverage, not pleasantries. He took one step, then another, walking back towards the light, towards the silent figures who had him so perfectly, so utterly cornered. He wasn't being arrested. He was being acquired. And as he passed the first man, the faint, sickeningly sweet smell of the glimmer moss filled his lungs, a prelude to a darkness far deeper and more complex than any compliance cell. The city groaned around him, a mournful sigh as he was swallowed by the sump's true shadow. The shove was surprisingly gentle, more a firm guide than a violent push. One of the Tidelords, a man whose face was a latticework of old keloid scars, nudged Jorin forward. "In," he grunted, his voice like gravel in a gearbox. The air changed instantly. Out in the makeshift warren of the black market, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of ozone from jury-rigged power taps, frying protein paste, and the damp earth perfume of glimmer moss. Here, inside, the air was different. Scoured. It was still heavy with the unavoidable metallic tang of the hall, but it was cleaner, drier, filtered. He was in a circular chamber, its curved walls pitted with the ghosts of decommissioned dials and pressure gauges. Thick bundles of armored conduit, like the fossilized intestines of some leviathan, snaked across the ceiling. But the industrial decay was a frame, not the picture. Draped over one wall was a bolt of synth silk, its deep crimson faded but still defiant against the rust-weeping steel. A desk, fashioned from the polished, dark carapace of some abyssal crustacean, gleamed under a focused work lamp. And in the center of it all, where a control console once sat, was a chair.
He was bigger than Jorin had imagined. Rumors in the sump painted the Tidelord as a monster, a brute who tore men apart with his prosthetic. The prosthetic was real enough. A massive hydraulic claw, matte black and articulated, rested on the chair's arm, its polished chrome talons looking sharp enough to shear through a bulkhead. But the man himself was still. He wasn't a caged beast. He was a panther at rest. His eyes, dark and intelligent, tracked Jorin's every movement as he and Hestian were ushered to the center of the room. He wore a simple, sleeveless tunic, revealing an arm and shoulder corded with dense muscle opposite the gleaming machine limb. He looked less like a thug and more like a deposed monarch holding court in the ruins of his own engine room. Grendel lifted his human hand in a small, almost lazy gesture. "Leave us." The scarred guard and his partner exchanged a glance, then nodded. They retreated, their heavy mag boots clanking on the grated floor. The heavy circular pressure door swung shut behind them with a deep, resonating clang, the locking wheel spinning with a final sealing hiss. The ambient chaos of the market outside was instantly muted, replaced by the low, almost sub-audible hum of the chamber's independent life support, and the faint whir of cooling fans from a bank of monitors behind Grendel's chair. They were alone. Jorin's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the deep, unending thrum of the city. He could feel Hestian's presence beside him, a small pocket of calm in the storm of his own anxiety. The whispers in his head,
the choir of the choral echo, were quiet. Not silent, never silent, but muted, as if they too were listening, waiting to see what this new power in the deep wanted. Grendel leaned forward slightly, the old chair groaning in protest. The movement was fluid, controlled. His gaze flickered from Jorin to Hestian, lingering on the Sumprat's calm demeanor with a flicker of what looked like academic curiosity, before settling fully on Jorin. "Jorin," he said. His voice was a low baritone, rough but clear, like stones grinding together far below. It was not the voice of a simple gangster. "The welder who talks to ghosts." Jorin's jaw tightened. He said nothing.
"The Spireborn call you Patient Zero," Grendel continued, his lips pulling into a thin, humorless smile. "Praxilavar's personal plague rat. They're tearing the lower levels apart, looking for you, turning neighbor against neighbor. Good for my business, bad for morale." He reached down beside his chair, and for a terrifying second, Jorin thought he was reaching for a weapon. Instead, he produced a simple, unadorned metal flask. With his human hand, he unscrewed the cap. The sound was small, precise in the quiet room. "But I saw the security feed from sub-level Delta, the conduit breach. That wasn't a guess, Welder. That was instinct. The kind that saves a few hundred souls from a high-pressure water grave. The kind that makes a man valuable." He gestured with the flask. "Thirsty?" The question was a physical blow. Thirst was a constant in the sump. The recycled water tasted of metal and chemicals, always leaving a film on the tongue, never quite quenching. Real thirst, the kind that cracked lips and clouded minds, was a weapon the Council used to ensure compliance. And inside Jorin's skull, a memory that wasn't his sparked to life. The sun, the endless burning blue. A splintered raft, the rasp of a swollen tongue against salt-caked lips, the desperate, mad desire for a single clean drop. He flinched, pushing the phantom sensation away. He stared at the flask. It wasn't a question, it was a test. It was an offering, a statement of power. "I have what you need. I have what the Council denies you." Slowly, deliberately, Jorin stepped forward. He ignored the slight shake in his hands as he took the offered flask. The metal was cool against his skin. He lifted it, the scent reaching him first. It smelled of nothing, absolutely nothing. Not ozone, not rust, not the faint cloying sweetness of the nutrient paste, just the clean, pure absence of scent that was the hallmark of true water. He took a sip. It was like drinking light. Cool, clean, and utterly pure, it washed the metallic grime from his palate. It was the most luxurious thing he had tasted in a decade. He swallowed, the simple act feeling profound, a stark contrast to the desperation of the phantom memory that still echoed in his mind. He lowered the flask, meeting Grendel's gaze over the rim. The Tidelord's eyes held a gleam of satisfaction. He leaned back in his captain's chair, the hydraulics in his prosthetic arm letting out a soft hiss as it shifted position. "They see a sickness to be purged," Grendel said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "A loose variable in their perfect, rust-rotted equation. They see a bug to be squashed." He steepled the fingers of his human hand, resting his chin on them. His gaze was intense, analytical. He wasn't treating Jorin like a prisoner or a biohazard.
He was treating him like a discovery, a rare piece of old-world tech unearthed from the abyssal mud. "I," Grendel said, letting the word hang in the filtered air, "see something else entirely. I see a key. I see an advantage." Jorin felt the cold dread of understanding begin to dawn, a chill that had nothing to do with the water he'd just drunk. The apprehension he'd felt walking in, the simple fear of a beating or a summary execution, was evaporating, replaced by a far more complex and terrifying emotion. He wasn't a captive to be interrogated. He was an asset to be appraised. The initial shock of being treated as a guest of honor curdled into guarded suspicion. This wasn't an act of kindness. It was the opening move in a game Jorin didn't know the rules to, played by a man who owned the board. And he had just accepted the first piece. The air in Grendel Brecker's throne room was thick enough to swallow. It tasted of ozone, rust, and the damp, peppery scent of the glimmer moss cultivated in grimy jars along the walls. The ghostly green-gold light it cast did little to soften the chamber's jagged edges. Wires, thick as pythons, snaked across the floor and up the curved interior wall of the massive, decommissioned turbine that formed the room. It was a metal gut, repurposed and humming with stolen power. At its center, Grendel sat not on a throne, but on a reinforced welder's bench, his bulk seeming to absorb the weak light. The soft hiss of the hydraulics in his left arm, a monstrous, custom-built claw of polished steel and exposed actuators, was the only sound besides the city's deep, perpetual groan filtering through the layers of metal. Jorin stood rigid, his fists clenched. His captors, two silent Tidelords with faces like chipped stone, flanked the entrance behind him. Hestian was here too, seated quietly on a crate to the side, their expression unreadable, but their presence a silent, stinging accusation. He had trusted them. He had followed them into the warren of the sump rats, only to be led into this cage. "I'm a welder," Jorin said, the words tasting like metal shavings. "I fix pipes, that's all. You have the wrong man." Grendel's lips, thin and bloodless, pulled into something that wasn't a smile. He was cleaning the central pincer of his claw with an oily rag, his movements slow and deliberate. Each wipe was a quiet metallic scrape. "A welder," Grendel repeated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from the turbine itself. "Of course, a simple hull clinger, earning his jewel chits, keeping his head down, deep and safe." He said the common greeting with a thick layer of irony. He set the rag down. "Let's talk about your work, welder. Let's talk about shift cycle 84, during the tremor tide, emergency dive to tap 3. Jorin's blood went cold. That was 3 weeks ago. The dive that had changed everything. "It was a standard repair. We get tremors all the—" "Don't," Grendel cut in, his voice dropping but losing none of its force. He didn't look up, his gaze still fixed on his gleaming claw. "Don't insult my intelligence. It's one of the few luxuries I have down here. I have the full report, my copy, not the Council's redacted version. A pressure spike tore a gash in your exosuit's left forearm. You were exposed to let's call it, a high-concentration particulate cloud. Abyssal microorganisms. You were in the infirmary for a full cycle, but they cleared you." He finally looked up, his eyes small dark chips of obsidian in his heavy face. "Tell me, Jorin, Have you had a moment of silence since? The question hit Jorin like a physical blow. The constant whispering static in his mind, the ghost voice of his daughter Lyra, now crowded by strangers, it all flared in his head, a furious shriek of denial. He flinched, a barely perceptible twitch, but Grendel saw it. Of course he saw it. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jorin lied, his own voice sounding thin and distant.
Grendel leaned forward, the hydraulics in his arm hissing softly as he braced it on his knee. "No? Then let's talk about last week. Sector Delta 9, primary water reclamation conduit, joint 14C. A catastrophic pressure failure was imminent. The alert klaxons were still spooling up, but you were already there. You didn't check the schematics, didn't wait for a diagnostic. You walked right to a support strut, 50 meters from the rupture point, torched a hole in the plating, and flooded a secondary overflow channel. A 1 in a million guess that depressurized the line and stopped the entire sector from turning into a high-pressure tomb." He paused, letting the silence stretch. Jorin could feel Hestian's eyes on him. He didn't dare look back. "They're calling you a hero up in the Spire news feeds," Grendel continued, his tone dangerously mild. "A testament to the vigilance of the Hull Clingers. It's rust-rot. I saw the security footage. You didn't even hesitate. You didn't think. You just knew. As if the pipe spoke to you, as if it told you where it was hurting. The memories of the dead weren't just voices, they were feelings, the crushing weight of water, yes, but also the groaning strain of metal, the agony of a weld giving way. Grendel was describing it perfectly. The thought made Jorin want to vomit. He felt stripped bare, his deepest, most terrifying secret laid out on a rusty workbench under the sickly glimmer-moss glow. "It was luck," Jorin stammered, the denial weak, pathetic. "Luck," Grendel mused. He flexed his metal fingers. They clicked shut with a sharp, final thump. "And I suppose it's just bad luck that compliance chief Praxilla Var, a woman who doesn't waste breath on accidents, has opened a Level 1 biohazard investigation? That her compliance officers are sweeping the sump with medical scanners, looking for one person? That in her classified communiques to the Triarch Council, she refers to this person as Patient Zero?" Silence. The word hung in the air. A death sentence. Patient Zero. A plague. A thing to be sterilized. Jorin's breath hitched. He finally understood. He wasn't just a fugitive hiding from a quarantine order. He was the reason for the quarantine. He was the disease they were hunting.
His defensive anger evaporated, leaving a hollow space filled with ice-cold dread. He felt his knees weaken. He was an open book, and Grendel had read every last word. Grendel stood up, his sheer size eclipsing the light. The hydraulic claw seemed to have a life of its own, its metal fingers twitching with minute, predatory adjustments. "But she's wrong," the Tidelord growled, taking a step closer. The smell of ozone and machine oil was overpowering. "Var sees a sickness to be cut out, a weakness in the hull. The Spireborn only understand purity and contamination. They don't understand transformation." He stopped directly in front of Jorin, close enough that Jorin could see the web of cracked capillaries in his eyes. "This isn't a disease, Welder.
It's a recalibration. The abyss is changing you. The choral echo, it's not erasing you, it's adding to you. It's giving you a new sense. The hull is the whole, right? That's the great lie they tell us. But what if one man could feel the whole? Every stress fracture, every failing joint, every groaning plate. What if he could hear the city's pain as if it were his own? Jorin stared, speechless, exposed, vulnerable. Grendel wasn't just guessing, he was articulating the very nature of Jorin's terror and turning it into a strength. The voices, the phantom pressures, the intuitive flashes, it wasn't madness, it was a recalibration. The idea was both horrifying and seductively simple. In the face of Praxilla's clinical manhunt, Grendel was offering him a different label. Not patient zero, something more, something useful. Jorin's gaze flickered to Hestian. Hestian's calm was gone, replaced by a look of profound worry, a silent plea. Don't listen. Don't believe him. But Praxilla's patrols were out there, and Grendel was here, and he knew everything. The denial was dead. The lie was over. All that was left was the terrifying, undeniable truth reflected in the Tidelord's hungry eyes. The air in Grendel Brecker's throne room was thick with the ghosts of dead energy. A decommissioned turbine, vast and silent, formed the chamber's back wall. Its colossal blades, coated in a fine sheen of rust and grime, curved out of the oppressive orange gloom cast by a single, sputtering sodium lamp. The deep, citywide thrum of Amphitrite was muted here, replaced by the sharp odor of ozone and the intermittent hiss of pneumatics from the Tidelord's arm.
Jorin stood before him, captive but not bound. His muscles ached with a tension that had nothing to do with the capture and everything to do with the man seated on a throne of welded salvage and stripped-down exosuit plating. Grendel Brecker was a creature of the sump's deepest pressures, his face a roadmap of scars, his one good eye pinning Jorin with an investor's calculating stare. The other side of his body was a monument to industrial violence, culminating in a massive hydraulic claw that rested, inert but potent, on the arm of his chair. Hestian stood a few feet away, a pillar of unsettling calm amidst the chaos of stacked jewel chits and salvaged data drives. Grendel's men had brought her in too, but treated her like a stray piece of art, something strange to be observed, not threatened. "I saw the compliance footage." Grendel's voice was a low rumble, like gravel tumbling in a deep shaft. "The pipe burst in Sector Epsilon, big one. Should have flash-flooded 3 levels, killed hundreds." He leaned forward, the sodium light carving deep shadows into his face. "But it didn't, because you were there. You didn't just weld the breech welder. You knew where it would fail before it did. You moved people out of the way. Like you could see it, hear it coming." Jorin's jaw tightened. Inside his skull, a faint, cold whisper echoed Grendel's words. "Hear it coming. Hear the water." He pushed it down. It was a lucky guess. Grendel let out a short, sharp bark that was almost a laugh. "Rust rot. Luck is for Spireborn, hoping their nutrient paste as flavor. Down here we make our own luck, or we find it." His gaze was sharp, predatory. "Praxilla thinks you're a disease, a symptom of a system failure.
She's hunting for patient zero to cut it out, burn it clean. He gestured around the room with his human hand. I can offer you something else. Sanctuary. A place to stay where her compliance thugs can't sniff you out. Real food, not just ration paste. Protection. The offer hung in the ozone-laced air, heavy and conditional. Jorin could feel the trap in it, the cold steel teeth just beneath the surface. What's the price?
Simple, Grendel said, a slow predatory grin spreading across his face. He flexed the fingers of his hydraulic claw. The sound was a soft, menacing whir click. You have a gift, an intuition. You see the cracks in the city, welder, the stress points, not just in the metal, but in their systems. I just want you to point them out. Ice flooded Jorin's veins. It was a cold deeper than the abyss. The memories, the echo, weren't just whispers anymore. They were faces. A young woman, trapped in a flooding conduit, her last thought a prayer for her brother. An old technician, his heart giving out as his maintenance pod lost pressure. His mind filled with the image of his wife's face. These were not cracks in the system. They were the final sacred moments of the dead. To use them, to weaponize their terror for a smuggler's profit. The thought was a violation so profound it made him feel physically sick. No, Jorin said, the word coming out harder than he intended. It's a desecration. Hestian's voice cut through the tension, quiet but firm. She looked at Grendel, her gaze unwavering. The echo is not a tool. It is a chorus. You would have him shatter it for scrap metal and glimmer moss. Grendel's eye swiveled to her, his expression one of dismissive curiosity. The Sumprat mystic speaks. A chorus of what? Ghosts? The drowned? They're dead, lady. Their songs are over. He's alive. He turned his attention back to Jorin, his voice dropping, becoming more personal, more venomous. They left me like this, you know. He lifted the hydraulic claw, the metal gleaming dully. A work crew from the spire, cutting corners on a pressure fitting. It blew, took my arm, 2 of my friends. Did the council compensate me? They ducked my pay for the damaged equipment. They use us. They break us. They throw us away, Grendel snarled, his face a mask of old fury. Praxilla and her masters in their clean, quiet atrium. They dissect you to find out what makes you tick, then flush the rest of you into the reclamation tanks. The council sees you as a sickness. I see you as the cure.
The words hit Jorin like a physical blow. A cure? The parasite that was eating his memories, stealing his daughter from him, piece by agonizing piece, was a cure? The monstrous irony of it was suffocating. He felt a phantom pressure building in his ears, the groan of stressed metal that wasn't in the room. It was in his head. A memory of a hull breach, but not his own. Someone else's terror. Someone else's end. He squeezed his eyes shut. His vulnerability was hardening into something else. A cold, defiant disgust. At Grendel, at Praxilla, at the city that was a tomb for them all. But Grendel was right about one thing. He was being hunted. He was out of time, out of options. You have nowhere else to go, Welder, Grendel pressed,
sensing the shift. Hestian's little flock can't hide you forever. Praxilla's patrols are sweeping the lower levels with biodetectors now. They're not just looking for a man, they're looking for the trace, the echo, and you're lit up like a geothermal vent. Jorin opened his eyes. He looked at Grendel's remorseless face, at the giant silent turbine behind him, at Hestian's pained, pitying expression. He was trapped. To survive, he had to make a deal with this devil. He had to take the screams of the dead and turn them into a key. The thought tasted like rust and bile. He would do it to survive, but he would never pretend it was a cure. One time, Jorin heard himself say, his voice a strained whisper, "A trial run. That's all." The defiant disgust remained, but now it was directed inward. This was the first step into a deeper abyss, one he might not be able to climb out of. Grendel's grin was a triumphant slash. The sound of his metal fist slamming down on a nearby table of scrap was like a gunshot in the quiet room. It echoed the closing of a door, the sealing of a pact. "Good," he boomed. "Your first job. Praxilla is moving a shipment of medical scanners through Sector Gamma 7 tomorrow. Tell me how to stop it."
"No," Jorin said, the word a shard of rock in the humid, ozone-thick air. "Absolutely not." His fists were clenched so tight his knuckles were white. The thrum of the decommissioned turbine at the heart of the chamber seemed to vibrate in his bones, a constant, deep-frequency reminder of the pressure all around them. "They aren't just rumors or intuition. They're memories. People. I won't desecrate them for your profit." Across the rust-stained table, Grendel Brecker watched him. The Tidelord's face was a mask of scarred indifference, but the single organic eye he had left glinted with something that was not quite amusement. His other arm, a monstrous assembly of salvaged hydraulics and polished steel, rested on the table. A low hiss of pneumatics punctuated the silence as the articulated fingers of the claw twitched. "He is right, Grendel." Hestian's voice was soft, but it cut through the noise. The sump rat stood beside Jorin, a thin, wiry figure swallowed by the shadows. "The echo is not a tool. It is a tide, a joining. To use it for this is to poison the water for everyone." Grendel let out a short, guttural sound that might have been a laugh. "Poison the water?" He gestured with his human hand at the chaotic sprawl of his throne room, the flickering salvaged monitors, the coils of cable hanging like metallic vines, and the stacks of jewel chits in grimy trays. "The water's been poisoned for decades, you rust-rotted mystic. The Spireborn piss in it from their clean rooms, and we're told to call it rain." He leaned forward. The massive claw arm remained still, a predator at rest. "I am not asking you to desecrate anything, Welder. I am offering you a life raft. You think your moral purity will stop Praxilla's boot from stamping on your face? You think you can hide from her, from compliance?" "I'll take my chances," Jorin snarled, the defiance hot in his chest. It was the only thing holding back the cold dread that was a permanent resident in his gut. "No," Grendel said, the word flat and final. With a smooth, practiced motion, Grendel turned to the bank of monitors behind him. The hydraulic arm whirred to life, its steel digits surprisingly deft as they danced over a control panel crusted with grime and hastily soldered wires. The claw was not a crude bludgeon. It was an extension of his will, precise and menacing. Several screens flickered through static and distorted images of sump corridors before one settled. A sharp electronic chirp signaled a locked feed.
"You see, Jorin," Grendel said, not looking at him, his voice a low rumble beneath the turbine's drone. "The difference between you and me is that I understand this place. Amphitrite isn't a city. It's a machine, a broken one. And if you know where all the broken parts are, you know everything." The screen cleared. The image was grainy, shot through a wide-angle lens that bent the edges into a nauseating curve. The light was the familiar sickly orange of a single sodium vapor lamp. Jorin's breath caught in his throat. It was the cistern, the hollow, echoing space where Hestian's people had given him shelter, the circular grate in the floor, the condensation-slicked ladder, the patch of green-gold glimmer moss he'd stared at for hours. It was the place he had just left. His anger evaporated, replaced by an icy wave of exposure. It felt like being naked under a searchlight. "How?" he breathed. "I have eyes everywhere," Grendel said simply. "Every forgotten junction box, every decommissioned vent. The Council thinks their network is secure. Their network is a sieve. I am the ocean that leaks through." As if on cue, movement flickered on the screen. From a darkened tunnel entrance, figures emerged. They moved with a chilling, synchronized purpose that was the antithesis of the sump's chaotic shuffle. They were clad head to toe in sterile white environment suits, their faces obscured by polarized visors. Compliance. The faint, tinny sound from the monitor's cheap speaker carried the crunch of their mag boots on the metal walkway. One of them swept a powerful beam from a helmet-mounted lamp, cutting a stark white line through the gloom. The beam passed directly over the alcove where Jorin had tried to sleep, where the whispers of a drowned navigator from a forgotten age had tried to show him the cold, dark beauty of a ship swallowed by the sea.
The memory fragment crushing weight, the taste of salt and fuel. A beautiful, terrible darkness flickered and died in his mind, snuffed out by the sterile white light on the screen. He felt a violation deeper than simple fear. "They move fast," Grendel observed, his tone conversational. "Praxilla is not sentimental. She's not hunting a man. She's tracing a contamination vector. And all vectors, Welder, lead back to you." Jorin couldn't look away. He watched the compliance squad sweep the cistern. One of them knelt, taking a scanner to the floor where he'd been sitting. The device whined, its lights blinking. The officer spoke, but his words were lost to the static. It didn't matter. Jorin knew what he was saying. "Positive trace. He is here." Hestian placed a hand on Jorin's arm. It was trembling slightly. "They are blind," Hestian whispered, his own faith wavering in the face of such methodical power. "They hunt a ghost they cannot comprehend." "They're not hunting a ghost," Jorin said, his voice hollow. He finally tore his eyes from the screen to look at Grendel. The dawning despair was a physical weight, pressing down on him like the ocean itself. "They're hunting me." The fury he'd felt moments ago was gone. It had been a luxury, a foolish belief that his will mattered. In its place was the cold, hard calculus of survival. He was a piece on a board, and the squares were disappearing one by one. Praxilla would find him. It was inevitable. She had the tools, the manpower, the unwavering conviction of a zealot. Grendel's expression hadn't changed. He held Jorin's gaze, letting the reality sink in. He didn't need to threaten. The monitor was doing all the work for him. "They will find you," the Tidelord stated, his voice a flat, undeniable truth. "It is only a matter of time. A few shifts, maybe, perhaps less. The sump is my domain, but it's still a cage,
A very large, very complex cage, but one with walls all the same. And she is checking every single bar. He leaned back, the hydraulics in his arms sighing softly. So you have a choice. It's not the one you thought you had, between using your gift and not. That choice was never real. The real choice, Grendel tapped the table with a chrome finger for emphasis, the sound sharp and final, is whether you are in my custody or in theirs when they come for you.
Jorin looked at the screen again. The white-suited figures were fanning out, their methodical search an omen. They were an antibody, and he was the infection. Hiding was no longer an option. Running was pointless. There was only the closing of the net. And here, in this suffocating, loud, stinking hole, was the only person offering to show him the gaps in the mesh. The cost was everything he had left of himself. The memories of a dead little burro, a drowned sailor, a terrified engineer. The echoes of lives he was now being asked to sell. His furious refusal felt like a lifetime ago. Now, all that was left was the despairing, pragmatic terror of a cornered animal. The Council sees you as a sickness. Grendel's voice was a low growl, grinding like rust against new steel. I see you as the cure. The words hung in the humid air of the decommissioned turbine chamber, a space that vibrated with the chaotic energy of the Tidelord's black market. The smell of ozone from jury-rigged power couplings warred with the damp, loamy scent of glimmer moss, cultivated in grimy trays. Jorin's gaze drifted from Grendel's scarred face to the massive, silent fan blades of the turbine behind him, a dead god in a metal tomb. Every surface was slick with the perpetual condensation of Amphitrite. Despair was a physical weight, pressing down on him almost as much as the 200 atmospheres of ocean above. He was trapped. Praxillus compliance officers were hunting him on the levels above, and here, in the sump's corroded heart, this brute with a hydraulic claw for an arm was offering him a cage of a different design. To use the memories of the dead for profit? It's a desecration, Hestian said, his voice a calm counterpoint to Grendel's rasp. He stood a few feet away, his sumprat rag seeming to absorb the sickly orange light of the work lamps. Grendel shifted his weight, the servos in his prosthetic arm whirring softly, a sound like chitinous insects. Desecration. The Spireborn desecrated my arm. They desecrate us every day with their ration cuts and their perfect clean air, while we breathe rust and mold. Survival is the only sacred thing down here, Mystic. And your friend here, he's the key. Jorin flinched. Your friend. The word echoed, wrong. The voices in his head, usually a low, sibilant chorus, surged in volume. The whisper of his daughter Ilara was lost in the swell.
Sickness, the cure. Sickness, sickness. The word began to pulse in time with the deep frequency thrum of the city. A new sound bled through the hum, a high rhythmic ping. It was alien to Amphitrite's symphony of groans and drips. It was older. I can't, Jorin managed, his throat suddenly tight. The air felt thick, heavy, like trying to breathe through a wet cloth. Ping, ping. The pressure started in his ears, a sharp, painful popping, as if he were descending too fast without equalizing. He swallowed, but the pressure only intensified, building behind his eyes. The orange lamps of the chamber began to flicker, not with failing power, but as if seen through a curtain of disturbed water. Can't? Grendel took a step forward, his shadow swallowing Jorin. "You saved 100 lives at that pipe breach. You didn't think, you just knew. That's not a sickness, welder. That's a weapon." Weapon. Sickness. Pressure. The words lost their meaning. The high-pitched pinging was closer now, a sound that screamed of claustrophobia. A new smell cut through the ozone and brine, the acrid tang of burning wires and the cold, sterile smell of pure, filtered oxygen. Then the cold hit. It wasn't the damp chill of the sump. This was an invasive, absolute cold that sank into his bones, a temperature his body knew meant death. He saw his own breath plume in the air, a white ghost in a room that was still oppressively warm. His vision swam. Grendel's scarred face dissolved, replaced by a cracked pressure gauge, its needle shuddering violently in the red. The decommissioned turbine behind him became a tight, curved metal wall sweating rivets of ice. A single, bare bulb, caged in wire mesh, cast a frantic red glare over everything. Emergency lighting. "No, no, not now. Please." He was no longer in Grendel's throne room. He was in a coffin, a steel coffin at the bottom of a forgotten sea. The choral echo wasn't whispering anymore. It was screaming. It was showing him. "Jorin! Jorin! Breathe!" Hwistion's voice was a distant echo, a radio signal from another world. A violent lurch threw him sideways. He didn't fall, but his body remembered the impact. He remembered the shriek of tearing metal, a sound far more final than any groan from Amphitrite's hull. He felt a phantom pain bloom in his side, where a piece of shrapnel had torn through the fatigues of a man who was not him, a man named Petrov. The name surfaced from the depths, slick with another man's terror. "The aft compartment is gone! She's taking on water!" a voice shouted in a language he vaguely recognized as an old-world dialect. "Seal the hatch! Seal it now!" Jorin's hands flew to his own throat. He could feel it, the icy, crushing pressure of the abyss. It wasn't just on the hull, it was inside, squeezing his lungs, forcing the air out in a panicked rush. He stumbled back, his real-world foot catching on a loose power conduit. He hit the grimy deck plate with a thud that barely registered. He gasped, but no air came. His mind, utterly hijacked, told him his lungs were already full. An imaginary frigid liquid was pouring down his throat, burning with the sting of salt. He could taste it, brine and engine oil. The world was a blur of red light and rising black water. "Help me!" The words were a strangled gargle, his own voice mixed with the death rattle of the submariner. He was drowning. He was drowning in a dry room. He clawed at the slick floor, his nails scraping against the metal. The faces of the dead crew flashed before his eyes, their mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with the horror of the deep. They weren't ghosts, they were memories, and they were becoming his. Through the roaring waterfall in his ears, one sound remained from reality, the clinical rhythmic whir-click of Grendel's hydraulic arm. He managed to force his eyes open, to look for an anchor in the storm. He saw the Tidelord standing over him. Hestion was frozen a few feet away, his face a mask of horrified pity. But Grendel was not. The large man was perfectly still, his one good eye narrowed not with alarm, but with intense, predatory focus. He was watching a tool demonstrate its function. He was assessing the strain, the output, the breakpoint. His expression was that of a man staring at a raw jewel crystal,
calculating its worth. It was a look of pure, unadulterated opportunity. That look of clinical patience was more terrifying than the drowning. Slowly, like a retreating tide, the hallucination receded. The crushing pressure in his chest lessened, leaving a deep, hollow ache. The phantom water drained from his lungs, and he drew a ragged, shuddering breath that scraped his raw throat. The air tasted of rust and decay, the familiar perfume of home. The red emergency light faded back into the sickly orange of the work lamps. The dead faces dissolved, leaving only the grimy, stained floor inches from his nose. He lay there, trembling, soaked in his own sweat, utterly spent. The agony faded to a profound, boneless exhaustion. He pushed himself onto his hands and knees, the echo of another man's death still clinging to him like a shroud. He looked up at Grendel Brecker. The Tidelord hadn't moved. A slow, grim smile spread across his lips, a crack in a stone facade. "See?" Grendel's voice was soft now, almost gentle. "A sickness like that, properly aimed, could cure this whole city of its leadership." Jorin stared into the man's eye, and for the first time since Ilara's death, the ghost of his daughter was silent. There was no room for her in his head. It was too full of the dead and the living monster who wanted to use them. The pressure receded. One moment, Jorin was drowning in another man's memory, the icy crush of the abyssal plain squeezing the air from lungs that weren't his, watching a little girl with auburn hair, no, blonde, no, his Ilara's hair, fade into the black. The next, he was just cold, soaked and cold. He gasped, a raw, shuddering intake of air that tasted of ozone and damp metal. His own lungs, his own terror. He was on his knees on a grated metal floor, the edges of the mesh digging into his palms. A tremor racked his body, a violent, uncontrollable shiver that had nothing to do with the chill of the chamber. It was the aftershock of the echo, the phantom agony of a death he hadn't died, leaving his nerves screaming in its wake.
The constant, deep-frequency thrum of Amphitrite vibrated up through the floor, a familiar hell that was almost a comfort after the screaming silence of the void. He blinked, trying to clear the ghostly green-gold bioluminescence from his vision. The chamber slowly swam back into focus. Grendel's throne room, a mockery of the name, built in the hollowed-out carcass of a decommissioned turbine. Wires hung like rusted intestines from the curved ceiling. The air was thick with the scent of hot lubricant and the briny tang of glimmer moss cultivated in a nearby trough. It was a den, a nest, a place of chaotic, defiant life. And Grendel Brecker was its heart. The Tidelord sat on his heap of salvaged plating and reinforced hydraulic pistons, motionless. He wasn't watching Jorin with pity or concern. His gaze was analytical, the look of a master technician observing a complex machine under extreme stress. His right arm, the one made of flesh and bone, rested on his knee. The left, a monstrous hydraulic claw scavenged from a cargo loader, was still, its polished pincers gleaming in the sickly orange light of a sodium vapor lamp. "The ghosts are loud in you, welder,"
Grendel's voice was a low rumble, seeming to come more from the chamber's metal walls than his own throat. Jorin didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat felt raw, scoured by phantom salt water. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming. His eyes found Hestian, standing near the far wall. The sump rat mystic's face was a mask of sorrow, his gaze fixed on Jorin, not as a weapon or a tool, but as a man in profound pain. That quiet judgment hurt more than Grendel's cold appraisal. But it wasn't Hestian who held the key to this moment. It wasn't Grendel either.
Praxilla would not offer a deal. She would offer a vivisection table. She would offer containment, sterilization, an end, a quiet, clinical end to the noise. The thought was almost tempting, to be scoured clean, even if it meant being scoured away entirely, to finally have the silence he craved. But the face from the hallucination swam behind his eyes, the girl, the one who for a horrifying second had worn his daughter's face before her own reasserted itself. A stranger's child, a stranger's grief. He had stolen it. The echo had made him a thief of the most sacred thing a person possessed, their end. To let Praxilla destroy him felt like letting all of them drown a second time, their last moments erased from the universe, archived in a dead man. "Weaponize it," Grendel had said. "The memories of the dead, their fears, their knowledge. Turn their agony into your advantage." The idea was a blasphemy that made his stomach turn. Hestian had called it a desecration. He was right. It was a vile, grotesque notion. But the compliance officers on the screen took another step. They were methodical, inevitable. They were the hull itself, unthinking, unfeeling, enforcing the pressure that kept the whole rotten city from imploding. They would find him. It was a mathematical certainty. And Hestian, for all his quiet faith, had no way to stop them. He offered acceptance, not escape. Jorin's gaze slid from the monitor back to Grendel. He saw the Tidelord for what he was, not a savior, but a different kind of abyss, one with rules, one with a price. Grendel's world was one of brutal transactions, power for power, life for leverage. He didn't offer salvation. He offered function, a purpose for the monster, a cage that was larger than the one Praxilla was building for him. "They see a sickness." Grendel's voice was a low growl, a perfect echo of his earlier words. He must have seen the struggle on Jorin's face. "I see a cure for the boot on our necks." Jorin's breath hitched. The ghost of Ilara's hand in his, small and trusting, flashed in his mind. What would she think of him now? The man who couldn't save her, now contemplating selling the memories of other fathers, other daughters, just to survive another day cycle in this rust-bucket tomb. He thought of the Spire atrium, a place he'd only seen on news feeds. Clean, bright, oblivious. The Spire-born, breathing clean air, living their lives on the backs of men like him, on the memory of men like the one who had just died in his head. Grendel was a predator, a sump shark grown fat on the scraps, but he was of the sump. He bled the same recycled water as everyone else down here. Praxilla, she served an ideal. The hull is the whole, an ideal that saw him, his grief, his curse, as nothing more than a fracture to be welded shut permanently. Agony gave way to something colder, a hard, brittle thing taking shape in the pit of his stomach. Resignation. It was the same feeling he had on a failing rig when the alarms were screaming and the only way out was through a sequence of terrifying life-or-death choices. There was no right path.
There was only the path that didn't kill you in the next 5 seconds. His eyes met Grendel's. The Tidelord's face was unreadable, patient. He was letting the equation solve itself in Jorin's head. Survival. That was the only variable that mattered now. Principles were a luxury for those who weren't being hunted. Slowly, deliberately, Jorin straightened his spine. The tremors subsided, replaced by a chilling stillness. He looked from the faceless hunters on the screen, the sterile white angels of his execution, to the monstrous, pragmatic tyrant sitting on his throne of junk. He gave a single, slow nod, a gesture so small it was almost lost in the gloom, yet it felt like a tectonic plate shifting deep within his soul, a hull breach in his own integrity. He had made his choice. He would not be a patient to be sterilized. He would be a tool to be used. He would desecrate the dead to keep himself among the living. The noise in his head did not quiet. It sharpened. Across the chamber, Hestian let out a faint, pained sound like a sigh of defeat and bowed his head. Grendel did not cheer. He did not pump his fist. A slow smile spread across his scarred face, not a smile of triumph, but of deep mechanical satisfaction. The smile of an engineer who has just heard a complex and problematic gear finally click perfectly into place. The hydraulic claw on his left arm twitched, and the massive metal pincers tapped once, twice, on the steel plate beside him. The sharp clink, clink was the sound of an agreement being sealed, the sound of a bargain being struck in the heart of the abyss.
The air in Sector GAMMA7 was different. It tasted sharp, scoured clean by the ozone leaking from high-yield power conduits. It was the air of the city's heart, a place of engineered perfection where the usual sump stink of damp and decay was not permitted. A massive, curved bulkhead dominated the maintenance corridor, its surface a seamless expanse of burnished alloy, cold and imposing. Bioluminescent fungi, which clung like desperate weeds to every surface in the lower levels, were absent here. The only light came from severe blue-white strips embedded in the ceiling, casting everything in the sterile glow of a morgue slab. Grendel Brecker stood with his arms crossed, one flesh, one a monstrous assembly of hydraulics and steel. The hydraulic claw, a relic scavenged from a cargo loader, twitched with a soft whir hiss, the sound of a predator's contained patience. "Well," he rumbled, his voice a gravel pit echo in the narrow space. "This is the artery. The shipment of scanners comes through here in 6 hours. Praxilla's little pet project. You said you could find a vulnerability. So find it." Hestian, a pale shadow beside Grendel's bulk, laid a gentle hand on Jorin's arm. Her touch was light, but it felt like an anchor. "Jorin, you do not have to do this. This is not what the echo is for. It is a history, a memory, not a lockpick." Jorin's gaze was fixed on the wall. He wasn't seeing alloy and rivets. He was seeing a tombstone. Every square meter of metal in Amphitrite was a monument to pressure, a constant battle against the crushing, final weight of the ocean. Using the voices of those the pressure had claimed, using their final screaming moments to help a black marketeer steal medical equipment, it felt like the ultimate desecration. "Rust-rot Hestian, save the sermon," Grendel snarled, taking a step forward. The floor plates vibrated under his weight. "Praxilla's thugs are sweeping the sump grid by grid. They have his scent. Right now he's my guest, but my hospitality has a price." The claw arm lifted, its polished talons glinting in the blue light. It hovered near Jorin's face, close enough for him to smell the lubricant. "You can listen to the ghost preacher and take your chances in a compliance cell,
Or you can listen to the groan of this city and earn your protection. Your choice, welder.
The threat was clear. The alliance was a cage, just one with slightly wider bars than Praxiella's. Jorin flinched away from the claw and gave Hestian a look that was part apology, part resignation. He turned back to the bulkhead and closed his eyes. Silence was a lie in Amphitrite. There was always the groan, a deep, subharmonic thrum that vibrated through bone and teeth, the sound of 1,000,000 tons of water trying to get in. For years, it had been the soundtrack to his grief, the background noise to the looping memory of Ilara's small hand slipping from his. Now he had to do the one thing he'd spent years fighting against. He had to lean in. He had to listen. He pushed past the thought of his daughter. He had to. This wasn't about her. This was about survival. He let the mental wall he'd so painstakingly built, the one that kept the worst of the whispers at bay, crumble into dust.
Now, the Curse of the Maker signal is a signal that MP is sending out to...
The choral echo hadn't just archived minds, it had archived their environment. It had recorded every vibration, every stress point, every subtle shift in the metal that had been their tomb. The screams of the dying became data points marking catastrophic failure. The city's low, constant thrum resolved itself into a complex, terrifying symphony. He could hear it all. The gurgle of recycled water through a kilometer of piping, the harmonic drone of the geothermal turbines 3 levels below, the faint, rhythmic ticking of a failing pressure seal in a neighboring sector. It was all there, a living, breathing schematic of Amphitrite's agony. His eyes snapped open, but his vision was bifurcated. He saw the cold, blue-lit corridor, but overlaid on it were shimmering lines of energy, stress, and flow. The world was a transparent blueprint, and he could read its every flaw. He took a step forward, his movement suddenly fluid and certain. He ignored Grendel's grunt of surprise, Hestian's worried gasp. He walked along the massive bulkhead, dragging the fingers of his right hand against the cold metal. The vibrations traveled up his arm, feeding the symphony in his head. It was no longer a cacophony. It was information, pure, unburdened by emotion. He was a sensor, a diagnostic tool. He walked 10 meters, 15. The shimmering data stream in his mind pulsed, leading him on. He stopped. In front of him was a conduit, thick as his torso, feeding a row of identical rectangular junction boxes bolted to the bulkhead. "What is it?" Grendel asked, his voice low, cautious now. Jorin didn't answer. He placed his palm flat against one of the boxes. It was no different from the others to the naked eye, just another piece of machinery in a city made of it. But to him it screamed, a single, discordant note in the grand, decaying orchestra. He felt its vibration, a tiny, frantic shudder out of sync with the deep hum of the systems around it. He pulled his hand back as if burned, and turned, his eyes distant, unfocused. His voice, when he spoke, was unnervingly flat, detached. The voice of a machine reporting a fault. "Here." Grendel stepped closer, peering at the box. "Here? Rust rot, Jorin. It's just another junction. There's a dozen of them."
Jorin's eyes slowly refocused on the Tidelord, but it felt like he was looking through him. The resonant frequency of the primary capacitor inside is off by 0.36%. It's not enough to trigger an alert, but it's generating a sympathetic vibration in the electromagnetic locking mechanism of the conduit's main access panel, 17 meters down the line. He raised a hand and pointed down the corridor. "When the transport comes through, its magnetic clamps will pass directly over that panel. The combined fields will amplify the faulty vibration. The lock will disengage." He closed his eyes for a second, the torrent of data receding, leaving behind a cold, hollow certainty. He felt sick. He felt powerful. "It will take a compliance security team exactly 47 seconds to override the manual release and secure the panel." A deep silence fell over the corridor, broken only by the hum of the city and the faint drip of condensation somewhere in the dark. Grendel stared from the junction box to Jorin's pale, sweat-slicked face. The skepticism in his eyes was gone, replaced by a raw, calculating avarice. A slow, predatory grin spread across his lips. 47 seconds, Grendel repeated, the words a soft, appreciative hiss. "Deep and safe. 47 seconds is all I need." The guard didn't speak. He was a slab of a man, his face a landscape of scars and indifference. He simply gestured with a thumb, a silent command for Jorin to follow. They walked down a corridor that felt alien. The floor plates didn't sag or weep. The walls were scrubbed metal, devoid of the ghostly green-gold bloom of glimmer moss. The air tasted different, too. The usual sump cocktail of damp, rust, and recycled breath was replaced by the sharp, sterile scent of ozone and the faint tang of machine oil. Even the city's eternal groan seemed distant here, a beast murmuring in its sleep rather than screaming in its death throes. Hestian was gone, taken somewhere else. Grendel had dismissed her with a wave of his flesh-and-blood hand, calling her a shepherd without a flock. Jorin had watched her go, her gaze a silent accusation that burned worse than any of Grendel's threats. Now there was only the rhythmic, heavy tread of the guard's mag boots on the deck, and the skittering of Jorin's own worn-out soles. His mind was a static hiss of numbness. The bargain was struck. The words still echoed in his skull, layered over the fainter whispers of the drowned. "I see you as the cure." He hadn't felt like a cure. He'd felt like an animal backed into a corner, baring its teeth. Now he just felt hollow. The guard stopped before a heavy pressure door, its surface painted a flat, impersonal gray. He keyed a sequence into a battered keypad next to it. A series of clicks, a pneumatic hiss, and the door slid sideways with a weight that spoke of reinforced plating. The guard stood aside. "In," he grunted, his first and only word. Jorin stepped across the threshold, and for a moment his breath caught. The room was small, a perfect cube, barely large enough for a man to stretch his arms out wide. But it was clean, impossibly clean. A single, unflickering light strip was recessed into the ceiling, casting a cold, even white glow. There was a cot against one wall, its synth fabric sheet pulled taut and military tight. A small metal table was bolted to the floor beside it. And on that table sat a brushed metal canister, condensation beading on its sides. Filtered water. A luxury so profound in the sump it might as well have been gold. He was so accustomed to the perpetual grime, to the slick of bioluminescent fungus on every surface, that the sheer sterility of the room felt like a physical blow. It was an absence. No drips, no rust rot, no chittering of piped vermin in the walls, just the deep, muffled thrum of the arcology, distant and steady. He heard the guard step back. Jorin didn't turn. He just listened. Jorin stood frozen in the center of the room, the sounds echoing in a space that was suddenly terribly small. He was safe. He was hidden from Praxilla's patrols. He had a place to sleep that wasn't a damp corner reeking of mold. He had clean water. He had everything he'd been running for. So why did the air suddenly feel so heavy? He slowly turned. The door was a seamless slab of gray. No handle. No keypad. No interface on this side. He walked to it, his movements stiff, and placed a hand on the cold metal. It was as impassive as a tombstone. He pushed. Nothing. It was as solid as the hull of Amphitrite itself. He wasn't a guest. He wasn't an ally being given sanctuary. He was cargo, an asset stored securely until needed. A choked, soundless laugh tried to escape his throat. It was perfect. The monstrous irony was almost elegant. For weeks he had craved silence. He had longed for a single moment where the whispers of the choral echo, the ghost of his daughter, the screams of the drowning would cease. And here it was. The room was practically soundproofed. The city's groans were gone. The cacophony of the sump was gone. Even the whispers in his own head seemed muted, baffled by the sudden lack of external stimulus. He had found his silence. It was the silence of a cage. He looked at his hands. They were caked with grime from his flight through the whispering gills. He saw a small alcove he hadn't noticed before, a sink and a dispenser. He walked over, turned the spigot. Clear, non-saline water flowed out. He washed his hands, the soap a harsh, unscented block. He watched the dirt and grime swirl away, revealing the pale skin and calloused welder's knuckles beneath. Clean. His hands were clean, but his soul felt like it had been dragged through the abyssal mud. He remembered the face of the first man whose death he had felt after the accident, a pipe fitter named Kalen, crushed in a maintenance shaft 2 levels down. Jorin had never met him, but in a blinding flash of synaptic theft, he had experienced the man's final seconds, the smell of ozone from a shorting light, the groan of buckling metal, the panicked love for a son who worked in the aquaculture farms.
The echo had given him that man's death, and Jorin had just sold it to Grendel Brecker for a cot and a canister of water.
Tell me how to stop it.
Grendel's voice, a gravelly command in his memory. He wanted to use Kalen's terror, his dying knowledge of a structural weakness, to ambush a medical shipment. He wanted to weaponize a ghost. Jorin leaned against the sink, his newly cleaned hands gripping the basin. His reflection in the small, polished steel mirror above it was a stranger, gaunt, wild-eyed, a fugitive. No, not anymore. He looked closer. He wasn't a fugitive. He was an instrument, a specialized tool, kept polished and locked away until the master craftsman had need of it. He had escaped the crushing, chaotic freedom of the sump for this, a clean, quiet, gilded cage. The dawning horror was a cold tide rising within him. He was safe from compliance, yes, but he had willingly walked into a different kind of prison, one where the walls weren't just metal, but his own moral failure. He had traded his agency for security, a piece of his soul for a moment's peace. He pushed himself away from the sink and walked to the cot, sitting down heavily. The surface barely yielded. He stared at the blank gray wall opposite him. The silence pressed in. In the sump, the noise was a constant companion, a shared burden. Here, the quiet was an accusation. It gave him nothing to hide behind, no distraction from the truth of what he had become. A captive asset, a ghost reader, a weapon in waiting. The faintest of whispers returned, a single clear thought that wasn't entirely his own. It was a fragment, a memory of a memory from a long-dead soul archived in his neurons, a pre-inundation banker who had lost everything. The cost of the transaction is always paid. Jorin closed his eyes. He had his sanctuary, and the price was just beginning to be tallied.